Right. This video is going to cover something that's covered in chapter 16 of the textbook, utility and marginal utility. So utility is a term that economists use to describe happiness, satisfaction, whatever people get from consuming goods and services. And we use this term utility as a shorthand, just as like, because it is like happiness, whatever you want to call it, pleasure. And we're going to assume that whatever people are doing, they end up getting utility from it. So that's going to be our way in which a consumer can compare very diverse or different experiences. So if you want to think about eating a cheeseburger or drinking a glass of soda, or going on a walk in the woods, or viewing art in a museum, all of those different activities are going to give you utility. We're going to assume that a consumer gets utility from doing all of these different things. Life is about, from our perspective as economists, life is about people trying to get utility. So we use the term utility as a shorthand here. It's important to point out that as we use it, we talk about people's what is known as subjective utility. Utility is completely subjective. It means subjective here, we mean from the perspective of the subject of our inquiry. So if we're trying to model your behavior, then what we have in mind here is your utility function, the utility, the happiness that you get from your experiences in life. We're going to assume that, that we can put a utility in a numerical scale. So that's just for a shorthand and convenience for us when we want to talk about consumers acting. So we assume that there's a whole bunch of mathematics behind this. We're assuming that people somehow have a utility function, and all these different things that they're consuming, experiencing, doing in life are giving them utility. And then we'll assume that because it's nice to be able to look at some concrete numbers like this, we'll talk about something like you're consuming goods and you're getting some total amount of utility from them. Now, it's important to note that as economists deal with utility, we do not assume there's any unit of utility. You might wonder, well, if there's no unit of utility, what are these numbers? Well, they're numbers, and there's a whole mathematical meaning of what they actually mean. But really the biggest thing here is that when you get more utility, a bigger number represents more utility, more happiness. And so that's the important thing. Another thing is that given our approach to utility, it's subjective. So we're looking at one person's utility. And then we say that there's no unit of utility. One of the things that this follows from this is that there's no way to make interpersonal utility comparisons. And that comes from the fact that we don't have a unit to measure the amount of utility that we get from it. The 19th century political philosopher and economist Jeremy Bentham wrote a lot about utility. He's famous for advocating utilitarianism. And he proposed that eventually we'd be able to get this unit of utility called a util. And maybe neuroscientists today are getting close to being able to measure that. But we don't have any way to measure the amount of utility that somebody gets from eating a cheeseburger or looking at a painting. And so there's no way to make comparisons of who gets the most utility or the most satisfaction from having a good. This is all personal. So whenever we talk about utility functions or utility numbers, that's one person's utility. It's completely and intensely personal, and there's no way to compare one person's experience with another person's experience. So, but it does provide us, as you think of utility numbers for one consumer, one person in isolation, it does provide us a way to get into a rational choice, what we'll call utility maximization. And that'll be the subject of the next video I make for chapter 16. So there's a couple of important concepts that come after utility, after we've introduced utility. And the first is marginal utility. I have the definition up here. It's the same definition that they have in the book. It's the additional satisfaction from consuming one more unit of a good or service. And so here I've got a utility scale here. So we can think about mozzarella sticks and then different quantities of mozzarella sticks that one person could consume here. If they're not consuming any sticks, we'll just call that total utility 0. But we could say it's 100 or 1,000. The important thing is you have some base level here. Might as well call it 0 because we're focusing on one person's choice here. And then what we can see here is that you have different amounts of utility that the person would get as they consume more mozzarella sticks. And now marginal utility would be the additional satisfaction that you get from consuming an additional unit of the good or service. And since we've got utility numbers here, the marginal utility is simply the difference or the increase in utility that you get from consuming one more unit. So you don't have any marginal utility for the 0 with mozzarella stick, but here in this case, so sort of irrelevant there. When you consume the first mozzarella stick, your utility goes from 0 to 16. So we could say that this person's marginal utility from the first mozzarella stick is 16. And then the difference here, it goes from 16 to 26. So that difference, 26 minus 16, that's a marginal utility of 10 from the second mozzarella stick. And then for the third mozzarella stick, total utility goes from 26 to 33. That difference is 7. So that's the marginal utility of eating a third mozzarella stick. And then the marginal utility from eating the fourth mozzarella stick would be 3. It goes from 33 to 36. Now, I picked these numbers sort of at random, but not completely at random, because I wanted to make sure that they would illustrate this next thing that we have listed here, and that's the principle of diminishing marginal utility. And it says that marginal utility declines as consumption of a good increases. And this should be qualified to say ceteris paribus, holding other things constant. As you consume more of one good, the marginal utility will go down. And it should also be qualified that what we're looking at here is some kind of a time period, right? Some kind of a fixed time period. Many Italians live to be into their 90s, and many of them drink wine every day. And so if you're a 92-year-old Italian who's been drinking a glass of red wine every day, has drunk tens of thousands of glasses of wine. But if it's one glass of wine every day over that period of time, that's enough period of time. We don't have to worry about the diminishing marginal utility when the amount of time is allowed to vary. So this would be the amount of mozzarella sticks you're going to eat, like when you sit down to eat a bunch out of a basket. And so the time has to be fixed that we're talking about for diminishing marginal utility. It's a period of time in which you're acting. We don't have to be specific about that period, what that period of time is. Is it like 1 hour when you sit down? Like if you're at a all-you-can-eat restaurant, you have 1 hour to eat and you can eat as much as you want, but you only have 1 hour to be fixed, or it might be 1 week, 1 day, 1 year, whatever our relevant time period that we're looking at. But that there is an amount of time, and time is fixed here, and we're assuming here that people would have to consume this good within that time period. So there's no like storing a good. It would be the amount of utility you get from consuming this good within some given fixed time period. And we'll even say that we might consider this diminishing marginal utility to be a law or a principle. And we do that because, again, we tend to think that we see a lot of activity or also introspection, which is another thing we could use here. We say like, oh, when you're really hungry and you go to happy hour and you're at a restaurant and you order that appetizer of mozzarella sticks, that first mozzarella stick that you eat is going to be really, really tasty. And if you're kind of hungry too, it like really hits the spot. And as you eat more from that, you're never going to get quite as much utility as you get from the first one. So I think we see in a lot of our situations in our life that that we experience diminishing marginal utility. Now, if we wanted to, we're not going to do really too much in the way of graphing utility or marginal utility in this class. But if we wanted to, we could construct a graph, and they have a graph in the book showing this, where you put marginal utility on the vertical axis and then consumption of the good on the horizontal axis. And if we have diminishing, and so then when you took these numbers here, these marginal utility numbers, and graphed them on a graph like this, This would give us the marginal utility. We can call it MU. If you have the principle of diminishing marginal utility apply, then when you graph the marginal utility curve, it should have a negative slope. It should be downward sloping, because that's what's reflecting the law of diminishing marginal utility, or the principle of diminishing marginal utility. That the extra utility you get from consuming an extra good is going down, and that's what you're getting here. So if you were to graph this, you'd have a marginal utility curve. It's going to be going downward. It could, in theory, in principle, consumption could, your marginal utility could become negative, where you can actually think of possibly making yourself worse off from consuming more of a good. Like, go eat so many mozzarella sticks that you give yourself a stomach ache, and then you don't feel good after that. Maybe you're even going to get sick. And at some point, it's like, oh, I ate too many mozzarella sticks, and the last couple ones that you ate that made you feel so bad probably actually lowered your utility. So we could, in principle, even imagine the possibility that marginal utility could become negative. We could also think it would just go to zero, like if you're familiar with the idea of asymptotically approaching the limit, you can think of this utility going to zero, getting closer and closer to zero, or you can think of it going negative. But this is utility, and the important thing to remember is that utility is intensely personal. There's no way to compare the utility that people get from the two different people get from consuming the same good. And although we use these numbers here, we're using them simply to allow us to think through the idea that people are getting utility, and then the amount of utility they get, and then like how is it going down. And then when we think about optimal consumer choice, we'll think about trying to maximize these utility numbers. So we use these utility numbers, but they are personal and they're subjective. They're based on the preferences or what a given person likes or dislikes. This is a person's utility function. And we take that utility function as given and assume that that's what they're trying to maximize. We don't judge or evaluate that. So that's marginal utility.